Our new CEO thought firing everyone over 40 would save tens of millions of dollars and clear the path for a massive buyout. He had no idea the veteran he just tossed aside was the only barrier keeping him out of federal prison. I packed my desk in 20 minutes, smiled at human resources, and walked out holding the sole legal rights to the company's central nervous system, leaving him clutching a live grenade with the pin pulled. Hello to our incredible audience here at Boss Revenge Stories. I need to share some difficult news with you all today, as YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the operating budget to continue uploading new videos on this platform for the foreseeable future. However, if you enjoyed today's story, I sincerely hope you will consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where we are moving our operations to bring you exclusive, longer, and more incredibly detailed true stories featuring emotional multi-voice narrations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment below. Now, let us begin today's story about a woman named Stella Johnson and the exact moment a corporate purge went horribly wrong. Julian Vance was exactly 34 years old, and he wore that number like a weapon. He had recently been installed as the new Chief Executive Officer of Novaris Logistics, a massive medical transport conglomerate dominating the industrial skyline of Chicago. We were not moving cheap consumer electronics or fast fashion. Novaris handled highly sensitive, heavily regulated medical freight. We transported temperature-sensitive blood plasma, emergency surgical robotics, and volatile chemical reagents across the country to Julian. However, the company was nothing more than a stepping stone on his glittering resume, a bloated entity ready to be aggressively trimmed and flipped to the highest bidder. He called a sudden, mandatory all-hands meeting on a dreary Tuesday morning, forcing hundreds of us to gather on the main floor of the primary distribution hub. The air was already thick with the kind of corporate anxiety that makes your throat go dry and your stomach churn. The massive robotic arms and high-speed conveyor belts behind the glass partitions were completely silenced for the occasion, creating an eerie, suffocating quiet that felt entirely unnatural in a facility that usually roared with the pulse of global supply chains. Julian stood on the temporary stage, bathed in the harsh industrial lighting, flashing a smug, perfectly practiced smile. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than most of the warehouse floor supervisors made in an entire month. He adjusted the microphone and began delivering a perfectly memorized monologue about embracing what he called the era of artificial intelligence. He spoke of streamlining, of aggressive optimization, and of shedding the dead weight of legacy thinking. He threw around buzzwords like algorithmic efficiency and autonomous paradigm shifts. He never explicitly used the words old or obsolete, but his implications were sharp enough to draw blood. He paced the stage, gesturing fluidly, suggesting that the veteran minds in the room were heavy anchors dragging behind a sleek corporate speedboat. Then, he finally dropped the hammer. He officially announced a so-called voluntary resignation policy. As he outlined the aggressive severance packages and the thinly veiled threats of impending terminations without any benefits, it became abundantly clear that this policy was a targeted, ruthless strike aimed directly at anyone over the age of 40. I sat near the back of the folding chairs. I am 43 years old, and until that exact moment, I was the lead engineer and director of system integration for the entire Novaris network. I did not need to wait for a formal meeting with my manager to know my fate. The moment Julian finished his grand speech, an army of young, sharply dressed human resources associates swarmed the aisles like vultures. One of them, a woman who looked barely old enough to rent a rental car, walked straight up to my desk after the meeting dispersed and handed me a thick white envelope. I held the premium cardstock in my hand, feeling its weight. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I stood up and looked around the vast, open-plan engineering department. My eyes scanned the room, catching the gazes of the people who actually kept this empire running. Over by the main server terminal, David, our chief robotics mechanic who knew the exact torque required for every joint on the sorting arms, was holding the exact same white envelope across the aisle. Maria, the logistics coordinator, who could reroute a fleet of refrigerated medical trucks through a massive blizzard blindfolded, was staring blankly at her own severance package, every single operational pillar of the company, the gritty, experienced people who truly understood how the monstrous machines and complex algorithms interacted in the physical world, had been handed their walking papers. Julian was purging the entire institutional memory of Novaris in one clean sweep. The young human resources representative hovered near my desk, shifting her weight nervously. She was bracing for a massive breakdown. She fully expected tears, outrage, or perhaps a desperate plea for a second chance. She expected me to yell about my years of loyal service or threaten a massive lawsuit, but I felt absolutely none of those things. I felt an icy, almost euphoric sense of absolute clarity. I knew exactly what Novaris Logistics was without us. And more importantly, I knew exactly what Julian Vance had just unknowingly done. I sat back down, opened the envelope with a steady hand, and pulled out the severance agreement. I did not bother reading the corporate boilerplate or the non-disparagement clauses. I simply flipped to the final page, clicked my pen, and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, even strokes. The representative looked shocked, her eyes widening as I handed the document right back to her. "Is there anything you want to discuss?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I only have one question," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and my expression entirely unreadable. "I need you to confirm in writing, right here on my copy of this agreement, the exact time, down to the minute, that my authority and all of my liabilities at this company officially terminate." She blinked, clearly confused by the specific and unusual nature of the request, but she was too eager to secure my signature to argue. She pulled out her company tablet, checked her directives, and scribbled a note on the bottom of the page before stamping it. "Your employment, along with all associated authority and responsibilities, officially ends at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon this coming Friday," she stated, sliding the paper back toward me. "Thank you," I replied gently. I smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to unsettle her even more. I picked up my security badge, the heavy piece of plastic that granted me access to the most secure, restricted sectors of the entire facility, and placed it gently next to my keyboard. I grabbed my coat and walked away from my desk for the absolute last time. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, I felt lighter than I had in 20 years. I knew a secret that the arrogant 34-year-old CEO on the stage did not. Julian Vance had not just optimized his payroll, he had just personally, arrogantly, and permanently signed the death warrant for his own glittering career. The sprawling Chicago headquarters hollowed out faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within mere days of the mass termination, the heavy, comforting presence of the veteran technicians evaporated entirely from the facility floors. In our place, Julian installed a legion of what he proudly called optimization experts. These were kids barely in their mid-20s, clutching sleek digital tablets and speaking entirely in the synthetic language of theoretical metrics. They walked the warehouse catwalks, staring intensely at efficiency graphs, completely oblivious to the harsh, grinding physical reality of the machines they were now supposed to manage. They did not understand the acrid smell of overheating hydraulic fluid or the subtle, dangerous vibration of a misaligned conveyor bearing. To them, a high-speed medical sorting line was just a line of code on a bright screen, a mathematical abstraction to be ruthlessly pushed past its physical limits to save a few pennies per hour. Julian Vance, meanwhile, embarked on an absolute media victory tour. Every time I turned on the financial news networks, there he was, sitting in pristine television studios, flashing that predatory, practiced smile. He openly bragged to the anchors about trimming the corporate fat, eliminating the outdated culture, and modernizing a dinosaur of a company. He was aggressively positioning Novaris Logistics for a historic acquisition. A massive global retail conglomerate was preparing to swallow Novaris whole, and Julian was loudly promising the financial press a finalized deal worth exactly $2 billion. He spoke passionately of the massive bonuses awaiting his executive board and painted himself as the visionary savior of the modern logistics industry. I turned off the television in my quiet suburban home in Evanston. The morning sun was just beginning to cut through the heavy, gray fog rolling off Lake Michigan. I walked into my kitchen, brewed a strong cup of dark roast black coffee, and carried the steaming mug down the hallway to my private home office. The house was perfectly still, a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was secretly brewing downtown. I knelt in front of the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor of my closet, slowly spinning the combination dial. The heavy locking bolts clicked open with a satisfying, deep thud. Inside, tucked far behind the emergency cache and the encrypted backup drives, sat a simple, thick manila envelope covered in a fine layer of dust. I pulled it out, carried it over to my mahogany desk, and broke the brittle old wax seal. The document inside was not a revolutionary piece of proprietary software. It was not a secret algorithm or a hidden backdoor into the corporate servers. It was something far more mundane, yet infinitely more dangerous in this highly regulated industry. The heavy parchment bore the golden seal of the federal government. It was a federal safety compliance certificate, specifically governing the autonomous operation of high-velocity automated medical sorting systems. I ran my fingers over the raised ink. I had earned this specific, rigorous certification exactly 15 years ago, long before Novartis became the corporate behemoth. It was today, back then. They were a struggling local startup, desperate to implement automated routing for hazardous biological materials, but completely lacking the necessary federal clearance to turn the machines on. That was the deadly secret buried under mountains of corporate acquisitions, shell companies, and legal restructuring over the past decade. Novartis Logistics did not actually own this essential safety certification. A corporation could not simply buy it outright. By federal law, the license was permanently attached to an individual human being and their registered private engineering firm. In this case, the license bore my personal name and the tax identification number of my private consulting firm. For over a decade, Novartis had simply been leasing the legal right to operate their heavy machinery through my direct employment contract. My active presence on the payroll was the absolute only thing legally shielding their entire automated infrastructure from severe federal violations. Julian Vance, in his blind, arrogant rush to replace experienced engineers with cheap, obedient analysts, never bothered to check the foundational legal scaffolding of the empire he was trying to sell. When he handed me that severance package and signed his name on the dotted line, my employment technically ceased. Therefore, the corporate lease on my federal certification defaulted to entirely void. I sat down in front of my computer monitor and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee. I navigated to the secure government portal for the Department of Transportation and Federal Logistics Management. I entered my administrative credentials, bypassed the biometric security check, and pulled up the active operational license for Novartis Logistics. The screen displayed a large green icon, indicating that the multi-state automated systems were functioning under full legal compliance. I moved my mouse carefully. I did not feel a single shred of guilt or hesitation. I clicked the cursor directly onto the bold red button labeled Revoke Authorization. A secondary prompt appeared on the screen, asking me to confirm the permanent termination of the operating license. I clicked Confirm. The web page refreshed, and the green icon immediately turned into a flashing crimson warning light. The federal system had officially accepted the revocation. I had just initiated an unchangeable, automated 10-day countdown. In exactly 10 days, the federal database would automatically trigger a mandatory, system-wide lockdown across the entire Novartis Logistics grid. The fuse was officially lit, and the flame was quietly burning its way toward Julian Vance. Deep inside the central command hub of Novartis, the first digital dominoes began to tip over. Tiny, isolated red alert banners started flashing across the primary monitoring dashboards. If my veteran crew had been sitting at those terminals, those specific error codes would have triggered an immediate, facility-wide halt. They were compliance failure warnings. The federal mainframe attempting a routine digital handshake and finding the proper credentials missing. But the fresh optimization analyst Julian had brought in simply saw annoying pop-ups cluttering their clean interfaces. I later learned from a sympathetic insider that the shift supervisor, a 25-year-old kid with a master's degree in business, but 0 days of actual floor experience, logged the critical federal warnings as a legacy software glitch. He arrogantly instructed his team to mute the notifications, absolutely confident they would patch it out during the next fiscal quarter. While his control rooms were actively suppressing federal alarms, Julian was 1,000 miles away, pouring every ounce of his frantic energy into the upcoming super demo down in Texas. Novartis had recently constructed a colossal mega warehouse just outside of Dallas, a sprawling 500,000-square-foot monument to automated logistics. This was the crown jewel where Julian planned to seal his massive $2 billion buyout. He had invited key state senators, aggressive venture capitalists, and the entire executive board of the retail conglomerate looking to purchase us. He was going to put on a theatrical show to ensure the spectacle was absolutely perfect. Julian issued a direct, unyielding executive mandate. He ordered the young engineering leads to bypass the standard safety limiters and push the autonomous sorting matrix in Dallas to 150% of its rated capacity. He wanted the heavy robotic arms moving faster than the eye could track, a blinding, chaotic display of mechanical supremacy. He was revving the engine of a massive, dangerous machine to the absolute red line, completely unaware that he had no steering wheel and absolutely no brakes. Back in my quiet office in Evanston, my computer chimed with a high-priority incoming message. It was an automated receipt from the federal administration. I opened it, my eyes scanning the dense bureaucratic text until I found the exact confirmation timestamp. The digital revocation of my federal safety compliance license was scheduled to become absolute at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on the coming Monday. I glanced at my calendar, a cold smile forming on my lips. Monday was the exact date Julian had scheduled his monumental presentation in Texas. The timing was so perfectly poetic that it almost felt orchestrated by a higher power, to ensure everything was executed strictly by the book and my hands were legally clean. I had my personal attorney draft a formal notice. It was a dense, highly technical legal email sent directly to the chief legal officer of Novartis, officially notifying them of the termination of third-party liability regarding the automated infrastructure. It was a massive red flag, a glaring legal flare shot directly into their corporate boardroom. But arrogance is a cruel master. Because Julian had also gutted the senior legal staff to save a few $1,000s, the email was routed through an automated sorting filter and landed on the desk of a junior legal assistant, this 22-year-old paralegal, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paperwork generated by the impending acquisition. Barely skimmed the subject line. Seeing the words, third-party liability, she simply assumed it was just another routine vendor contract expiring for the cafeteria services or the janitorial staff. She did not escalate it. She did not forward it to the chief legal officer. She simply dragged the most explosive legal document in the company's history into a digital archive folder and went out to get her lunch. The countdown was no longer a silent threat. The weekend passed in a tense blur of anticipation. I could practically visualize the frantic, blind energy buzzing through the Dallas facility. Dozens of inexperienced technicians, sweating under the harsh industrial lights, blindly stripping away the software safeguards, just as their CEO had demanded. They were tuning the heavy conveyor belts to move at terrifying speeds, preparing to juggle thousands of pounds of sensitive medical equipment in the air. Julian was building a massive house of cards on a fault line, screaming at his subordinates to stack the deck higher and higher. He wanted absolute perfection for his billionaire guests. He wanted the television cameras rolling and the politicians smiling. He was about to get exactly what he asked for. Every single steel gear, every pneumatic piston, and every line of code was hurtling forward at maximum velocity, rushing blindly toward 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The bomb was primed. The pin was completely gone, and Julian was proudly holding it up for the entire world to see. I sat at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of coffee, the high-definition live broadcast streaming perfectly across my laptop monitor. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning on Monday. The visual coming out of Texas was nothing short of a corporate cathedral built to worship greed. The newly constructed mega warehouse in Dallas was breathtaking in its scale, spanning 500,000 square feet of pristine, polished concrete and gleaming steel. Julian had spared absolutely no expense for this spectacle. Brilliant theatrical lighting bathed the facility in a crisp, futuristic glow, completely hiding the grime and grease that usually accompanied industrial logistics. Standing on a massive, elevated stage in the center of the facility, Julian looked like a conqueror. He was surrounded by a literal army of television cameras, financial journalists, and the most powerful venture capitalists in the state. In the front row sat the executive board of the massive retail conglomerate, the men and women holding the checkbook for the $2 billion acquisition. Behind Julian, the warehouse was a blur of terrifying, unbridled motion, because he had ordered the safety limiters completely stripped away. The high-speed conveyor networks and massive robotic sorting arms were operating at a blistering, chaotic pace. It was a mechanical ballet running at fast forward. Julian gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, leaning into the microphone with absolute supreme confidence. "What you are witnessing behind me is not just the future of logistics," Julian declared, his voice echoing through the massive cavernous space and booming through my laptop speakers. "This is a proprietary, closed-loop ecosystem. The technology, the software, and the physical infrastructure you see today are 100% owned and operated by Novaris Logistics. We answer to no one but the future." I glanced down at the digital clock on the corner of my screen. It read 8:59. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I did not feel anxious. I felt like a sniper watching the wind align perfectly with the crosshairs. "We have cut the dead weight," Julian continued, gesturing widely to the executives in the front row. "We have streamlined our operations, removing outdated human bottlenecks to create an unstoppable, infinitely scalable machine." The clock struck exactly 9 o'clock, deep within the federal servers hundreds of miles away in Washington. My license officially hit its expiration timestamp. The Department of Transportation database pinged the Novaris central mainframe, demanding the mandatory safety handshake. It found absolutely nothing. The legal void triggered an immediate, automated, and violently uncompromising protocol. It did not happen slowly. It happened with the devastating immediacy of a lightning strike. The federal kill switch slammed into the Novaris operating system across the entire 500,000 square feet of the Dallas facility. Thousands of massive robotic arms, hypervelocity conveyor belts, and automated transit vehicles lost their operational authorization in the exact same millisecond. They did not gracefully power down. The emergency magnetic brakes engaged instantly at maximum velocity. The sound was absolutely catastrophic. Through the live broadcast feed, I heard the deafening, bone-rattling shriek of steel grinding against steel. Heavy kinetic momentum violently met immovable force, because Julian had forced the machines to run wildly past their weight limits. The abrupt halt caused thousands of heavy medical crates to become airborne projectiles. Massive reinforced boxes filled with expensive surgical robotics, glass vials, and heavy machinery launched off the belts, smashing onto the polished concrete floor below. The sickening crash of shattering glass and snapping plastic echoed through the warehouse like an artillery barrage. Aerial delivery drones, suddenly completely cut off from the navigation matrix, simply dropped from the high vaulted ceilings, shattering into hundreds of pieces on the ground directly in front of the horrified investors. The pristine, futuristic white lighting of the mega warehouse violently snapped off, instantly replaced by the sinister, rotating glare of red emergency strobes. A deafening, piercing klaxon alarm began to blare, drowning out the terrified screams of the crowd. Behind Julian, the massive presentation screens that had just been displaying climbing revenue graphs glitched violently. The screen tore, flashing bright white before solidifying into a stark, blood-red background. Bold, unmissable white text flashed across every single monitor in the building, large enough for every camera in the room to capture perfectly. Critical violation. Unlicensed operation. Federal lockdown activated. Total. Mitigated pandemonium erupted on the warehouse floor. The billionaire investors in the front row were jumping out of their expensive chairs, throwing their hands over their ears to block the deafening sirens, their expensive suits peppered with the flying debris of shattered drones. Julian stood completely frozen at the podium, all the color instantly draining from his face. The smug, predatory conqueror had vanished, replaced by a terrified little boy who had just broken something he did not understand. He frantically tapped his microphone, attempting to project over the deafening alarm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain entirely calm," Julian stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "This is just a minor technical glitch, a small software update overlapping with the hardware. We will have this sorted out in just a few minutes." He forced a sickeningly awkward laugh, looking desperately at the cameras. But the federal government does not do technical glitches. The heavy, industrial steel doors of the main loading dock, located just to the right of the presentation stage, suddenly exploded open. The sunlight poured in, quickly blocked by a massive convoy of heavy, black, armored SUVs. They did not stop at the gate. The vehicles screeched straight onto the polished warehouse floor, their tires squealing wildly as they formed a barricade right in the middle of the live broadcast. Dozens of federal agents in heavy tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, weapons holstered but hands ready. They were wearing jackets emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the federal administration. They were not there to help with a software update. They were raiding an active multi-million-dollar criminal operation. Through the television feed, I watched the lead executive of the retail conglomerate violently shove his way through the panicked crowd. He was screaming furiously into his cell phone, demanding his legal team pull every single contract and sever all ties immediately. The realization washed over the entire room like a bucket of ice water. The investors realized in real time that they had almost handed $2 billion to a company operating a massive, unregulated, illegal hazard zone. Julian Vance stood entirely alone on the stage, bathed in the flashing red lights of his own destruction, watching his historic $2 billion acquisition evaporate into thin air on live national television. Within a matter of hours, the public valuation of Novartis Logistics went into a terrifying terminal freefall. The stock plummeted by exactly 60% before the frantic trading floor executives were forced to manually halt all market transactions to prevent a total corporate collapse. Every major financial news network in the country completely abandoned their scheduled programming. The catastrophic, chaotic footage of the Texas facility raid played on a continuous, brutal loop across every screen in America. The sleek, futuristic corporate narrative was dead, instantly replaced by blazing, unforgiving headlines exposing the harsh reality. Novartis had been operating a massive, highly regulated automated network entirely illegally, stripped of all federal oversight. The retaliation from the corporate overlords was swift and violently unforgiving. The primary board of directors, a collection of incredibly wealthy and notoriously ruthless individuals, scrambled their private jets and descended upon the Chicago headquarters in a state of absolute, unhinged fury. They immediately convened an emergency session in the highest boardroom of the corporate tower, a massive, imposing room encased in soundproof glass and lined with heavy imported mahogany. They summoned Julian Vance to answer for the absolute apocalypse he had just unleashed upon their empire. They also summoned me. I did not wear a tailored business suit or a crisp silk blouse. I walked through the heavy double doors of that suffocating, hyper-luxurious boardroom wearing faded blue jeans, heavily worn boots, and a vintage black leather jacket. I carried absolutely nothing except one single, thin manila folder tucked casually under my right arm. The contrast was intentionally jarring. The air in the room was thick enough to choke on, vibrating with the silent, terrified panic of billionaires watching their vast fortunes burn to ashes. I took a seat at the far end of the incredibly long table, leaning back in the plush leather chair with a terrifyingly calm demeanor. I did not speak. I simply watched the room. Julian was pacing erratically near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, polished conqueror who stood on the Texas stage just a few hours prior. His expensive tie was ripped open. His hair was entirely disheveled and dark. Heavy sweat stains soaked through the armpits of his bespoke shirt. The moment I sat down and made eye contact with him, he lost whatever fragile grip he still had on his sanity. He lunged toward the table, violently slamming his flat palms against the polished wood. The loud, sharp crack echoed off the glass walls like a gunshot. "You did this!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his trembling lips. "You engineered this entire disaster. I am going to sue you into absolute oblivion. I will have you locked in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life for maliciously sabotaging company property." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer a single defensive word. I simply nodded to the man sitting in the chair immediately to my left. It was my personal attorney, a man possessing a remarkably quiet voice and a historically devastating record in corporate litigation. He did not yell back at the frantic chief executive officer. Instead, he calmly unlatched his leather briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it gently across the polished expanse of the mahogany table. It came to a smooth stop directly in front of the chairman of the board. It was the exact severance agreement the Human Resources Department had handed to me just days ago, the very same document that cleanly and permanently terminated my employment. My client did not sabotage anything, my attorney stated, his voice smooth and ice-cold, cutting through the frantic energy in the room like a surgical scalpel. The federal operating license required to run your automated infrastructure is permanently attached to my client as a private individual. For over a decade, this corporation legally leased that right through her active employment status. However, your brilliant chief executive officer forcefully terminated that employment, aggressively insisting on a signature to remove her from the premises. My attorney leaned forward, tapping a heavy silver pen directly onto the bottom of the page. If you look closely at the ink right there, you will see Julian Vance's own authorized signature, actively severing my client from this company. Furthermore, the Human Resources representative explicitly confirmed, in writing, that all of my client's legal authority and liabilities regarding this corporation ended completely at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon last Friday. The chairman of the board stared down at the paper, his wrinkled face, already pale from the morning's disaster, drained of all remaining color, taking on the sickening gray hue of a corpse. By legally forcing out the singular individual holding the operational rights, Julian actively chose to run the entire network completely blind, my attorney continued, turning his piercing gaze toward the sweating CEO. He then willfully and publicly paraded a powerful group of investors into a highly hazardous environment, actively attempting to finalize a $2 billion acquisition, while intentionally hiding the fact that the company was committing massive regulatory violations. My client merely updated her employment status with the Federal Registry, exactly as required by federal law. Julian Vance, on the other hand, just committed textbook, verifiable commercial fraud on national television. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, crushing silence of a submarine sinking far below its structural depth. The board of directors collectively stopped breathing. They looked at Julian not with anger, but with the hollow, terrifying realization that the arrogant 34-year-old man standing before them had not just destroyed their immense wealth by lying to the federal government and attempting to defraud a massive corporate buyer. Julian had successfully dragged the entire executive leadership team right to the very edge of federal indictments and mandatory prison sentences. The balance of power in the room did not just shift, it violently and completely inverted, landing entirely in the palm of my hand. The chairman of the board, a man who usually commanded rooms with a terrifyingly quiet whisper, suddenly stood up and pointed a trembling finger directly at his chief executive officer. "Shut your mouth!" the chairman roared, his voice echoing violently off the heavy glass walls. "Do not speak another word, or I swear to God, I will personally have you thrown out of that window." Julian froze, his mouth snapping shut as he backed away against the window pane, looking exactly like a cornered, panicked animal. The chairman took a deep, ragged breath and turned his attention back to me. The absolute fury in his eyes was instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated desperation. He leaned over the polished mahogany table, clasping his hands together in a pleading, desperate gesture. "Stella, please," he begged, his voice dropping to a hoarse, shaky whisper. "Name your price. Tell us the exact number it will take to make that federal red light turn green again. We will wire the funds into your personal offshore accounts this very minute. Just give us a number." I looked at the chairman, then slowly shifted my gaze to the terrified 34-year-old man cowering by the window. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. I shook my head. "I do not want a single dime of your corporate emergency funds," I replied softly. The boardroom erupted into a chaotic murmur of confusion. The wealthy executives looked at each other in sheer panic. If I did not want money, what on earth was I doing there? I held up my right hand, and the room instantly fell dead silent again. "I have two strict conditions for the immediate reinstatement of the federal compliance license," I stated clearly, letting every syllable hang in the heavy air. "My first demand is the immediate, non-negotiable termination of Julian Vance, effective right this very second, and I do not mean a quiet resignation. He is to be fired on the explicit grounds of gross misconduct and massive corporate fraud. Furthermore, you will completely strip him of his golden parachute, zero out his massive severance package, and permanently seize his entire unvested equity portfolio." Julian let out a visceral, agonizing scream. "You cannot do that. I built this new vision. I am the chief executive officer," he shrieked, lunging forward toward the table, completely losing his mind. The chairman did not even look at him. He simply raised his voice over the frantic screaming. "All those in favor of immediately terminating Julian Vance for gross misconduct, stripping all benefits and equity, say aye," the chairman commanded. A chorus of loud, immediate ayes echoed around the long table. The vote was entirely unanimous. Julian Vance was completely erased from the corporate registry in less than 10 seconds. "Guards, physically remove this man from my building," the chairman barked into the communication intercom on the table. Two massive corporate security officers burst through the heavy boardroom doors. They grabbed Julian roughly by both of his arms. He kicked, thrashed, and screamed wildly, completely stripped of his arrogant dignity, as they dragged him out of the room and hauled him down the hallway toward the freight elevator. Once his hysterical screaming faded away, I leaned forward and addressed the breathless board members. "My second requirement is equally non-negotiable. By the end of business today, Human Resources will issue a formal apology and a reinstatement letter to every single employee over the age of 40 who was wrongfully terminated last week. They will return to their original positions. Their seniority will remain fully unbroken, and every single one of them will receive an immediate 20% salary increase." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats at the immense financial implication of that demand. I did not give them time to complain. "And you will fund every single penny of those raises directly from the confiscated executive bonus pool you just stripped from Julian," I added, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. The chairman let out a long, heavy sigh, collapsing back into his leather chair. He looked completely defeated, but also immensely relieved. He nodded slowly. "Draft the paperwork," he ordered the corporate secretary. "Give her exactly what she wants." Within 20 minutes, the revised, legally binding contracts were drafted, printed, and signed by every single member of the board. They slid the massive stack of papers across the table to my attorney, who reviewed them meticulously before giving me a short, affirming nod. The entire room watched me with bated breath. I casually reached into the pocket of my leather jacket and pulled out my mobile phone. I opened the federal credential application. I typed in a short, encrypted 12-digit confirmation code and hit send. High above the table, a massive television screen was still broadcasting the chaotic news coverage of the Dallas warehouse. Right before their very eyes, the flashing red emergency strobes in the Texas facility suddenly switched back to bright, pure white light. The heavy magnetic brakes released with a loud mechanical hum that we could hear through the broadcast. The massive robotic arms slowly reset to their default positions, and the conveyor networks hummed back to life, perfectly compliant and fully legal. The federal agents on the screen received the all-clear signal on their radios and immediately began backing their tactical vehicles out of the loading bays. The collective sigh of relief in the boardroom was so loud, it sounded like a sudden gust of wind. They had survived, but they all understood that they were no longer in charge. I stood up from the table, picked up my single manila folder, and walked out of the boardroom without saying another word. I did not head toward the main lobby. Instead, I walked straight down the executive hallway, my boots clicking softly against the polished marble floor. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the sprawling, hyper-luxurious corner office that previously belonged to the chief executive officer. The desk was pristine, dominated by a heavy, gold-plated nameplate that read, Julian Vance, CEO. I picked up the heavy piece of metal, weighed it in my hand for a brief second, and casually tossed it straight into the metal trash can in the corner. It hit the bottom with a loud, deeply satisfying crash. I walked around the massive mahogany desk, sat down in the enormous plush leather chair, and slowly leaned back. I took a deep breath, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. Then, I pulled the keyboard toward me, opened the global company directory, and began drafting a company-wide email to warmly welcome my old friends back home. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means the world to me and the entire team here. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube has unfortunately disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us entirely without an operating budget. Because of this, we absolutely cannot upload new videos here for the foreseeable future. If you found today's story satisfying and want to hear even more incredible, highly detailed true revenge stories that we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube, please help us keep going by joining our Patreon. Your support directly allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to life. You can join right now by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again for everything. Take care, and I will see you over on Patreon.